Please welcome Dr. Josh Barron, Laura Cunningham, and Roger Dingledine.
Hi everyone, I'm Josh Barron. I'm a program manager here at DARPA, and thank you for attending this session. At DARPA, I work programs in cryptography, privacy, and anonymity. Probably most germane to this particular panel, I run the Resilient Anonymous Communication for Everyone, or RACE program. That's about building an open source, secure messaging application and architecture that could, at least ideally, survive anywhere in the world over the standard internet. And then I run another program called Measuring the Information Control Environment that seeks to leverage AI to build atop existing open source systems that measure how countries censor and surveil their internet in order to try to be more scalable at what they notice and then how fast they can present it in a meaningful way.
Great. I'm Laura Cunningham. I'm the president of the Open Technology Fund. OTF is a nonprofit funded by the federal government that aims to advance internet freedom globally. We do that by investing in the research, development, implementation, and maintenance of internet freedom technologies, focusing particularly on circumvention technologies, as well as security and privacy enhancing tools to support citizens, human rights defenders, and journalists living in authoritarian countries.
Hi, I'm Roger Dingledine. I'm one of the founders of the Tor Project, which is a nonprofit that writes privacy software to try to help people around the world be safe and empower them to learn things from the internet and publish things on the internet. So we're part of a bunch of larger ecosystems. One of them is the internet freedom one that we're talking about here. Another one is the academic censorship research or academic privacy research or the free software world. And I sort of live in all of those different worlds. And part of the fun of working on Tor is that we talk to activists in Tunisia and journalists at the New York Times and military DARPA people, and all of them need the same privacy tools because privacy needs a diversity of types of people who are using it in order for all of them to be safe. So we have millions of people each day who use the Tor network. It's run by volunteers all around the world. We'll go from there.
Excellent. So before we get into the various questions, so I'll be driving with the questions, but also engaging in conversation with Laura and with Roger. But I do want to say that we very much, we're at the end of the day. We got one more talk. Let's be interactive. If this is a material you find particularly interesting or you have questions, please don't hesitate to use the QR code thing and ask us questions. And let's make this fun. Laura. How does internet freedom technology intersect with US national security interests?
So great question. I think, as a jumping off point for most of the work that we do on internet freedom, obviously it comes from more of a kind of foreign policy, human rights based strategy. In order to make sure that individuals anywhere in the world are able to access information, share information, and express themselves freely without fear of censorship or surveillance. That being said, I think there is a really important and kind of critical intersection between the human rights work we do and national security. There is obviously the large and philosophical argument about how more democratic and free countries make strong allies and are stable. But I think even more interesting today in the kind of era of the internet, ensuring that individuals and citizens in authoritarian regimes in particular have access to independent and truthful information has become really critical as we think about what national security means for us. I think one of the most effective and probably low-cost ways to hold authoritarian or repressive governments accountable is with their own citizens, and making sure that citizens in those countries have access to truthful information, aren't being censored, aren't being fed misinformation, and are able to make decisions to hold their governments accountable and really to be that first check on some of their government impulses. I think that's become particularly important today in places like Russia, where having the Russian citizenry understand what is really happening in the war that Russia is raging on Ukraine is critically important in terms of pushing back on some of those impulses. So I think there really becomes an important intersection there when we think about how important empowering citizens is in terms of being that first check on kind of government abuse.
I know from my perspective, almost more on the, I suppose, pure technology or even more the DoD side, what I think has been historically underappreciated is the role. So we tend to think about militaries operating on the internet, and then we talk about companies being on the internet. But what people often don't think about is that, when we talk about, countries around the world are often paying extremely careful attention to their own internet, not for computer security or even cyber operations perspectives, but actually from internet freedom. That the thing that many, especially authoritarian regimes, that they're just so highly motivated to understand everything flowing across their networks, because domestic stability is their #1 priority. And so it is more important than like just a cyber hygiene, like they just have to know everything. And I feel like we're kind of now coming to that realization. We have these increasing reports on like balkanization of the internet. Mm-hmm. They're happening not from like a cybersecurity standpoint. They're happening from each country feels the need to control their own internet. And that a lot of what we see in terms of how networks are changing, the structure of the internet's changing around the world is largely flowing from that issues associated with internet freedom.
Yeah, so there's the policy side that Laura talked about, which is empowering civil society and empowering individuals to be able to have control over what they are learning about and what they're telling people. And that, if you believe that that robust democracies are important for U.S. national security, then it's clear that that empowering people around the world to be the people they want to be is how you get that national security. But also from a very practical perspective, a bunch of the internet freedom tools like Tor, they're useful for activists, but also militaries use them. Militaries rely on Tor. I've talked to people at the NSA and the CIA who say that they need Tor and they use Tor and they rely on Tor. A few years ago, there was a particularly bad story where apparently the CIA had rolled their own anonymity system, and they had their own ways of connecting to their agents. And they did it by making up a bunch of fake websites, but all the fake websites had something similar. So if you Googled for the similar thing, you found every CIA agent using this anonymity system. And Iran learned about this and told China, and then all those people were killed. And the lesson there is don't roll your own anonymity system. Use a system that many other people use so that you're blending in with activists and journalists and companies and other government agencies. So it's not just the first answer is definitely the right one, which is the policy side, which is internet freedom is important for making the world a safer place. But also from a practical national security side, governments use this stuff too.
Fair enough. I should probably foot stomp that some of the things you said there are according to public press reports, and gosh only knows whether that's the case or not, but certainly if some of that's true, that could be potentially concerning. So I would say, so to what extent do you all think that U.S. national security enables, or for that matter impedes, internet freedom technology and its proliferation?
Who would start?
Yeah, please.
You got it. So I think I'll go with the impedes part of that question first, I think, because that is often, unfortunately, where we see kind of national security and internet freedom kind of coming to a head. And I think one of the challenges for us is often unintended consequences of national security decisions, having a ripple effect on internet freedom and making that work harder, often undermining the effectiveness of different technologies that have an important kind of freedom of expression or internet freedom or human rights use case. So a couple of examples that we've run into in recent years that have been, and actually just within the last couple of months, that have been really challenging are around national security related sanctions. So sanctions on places like Iran and Russia that have had the intended consequence of controlling technologies that could be used by an authoritarian regime, but ultimately cutting off citizens from critical technologies themselves. So in Iran, a longstanding challenge there has been sanctions that up until recently have prevented the use of Google Cloud Computing, and have undermined some of our circumvention techniques in Iran. So while one of the goals has been to promote freedom of expression and promote democracy there, simultaneously, some of these sanctions, without kind of a technical eye to them, have had unintended consequences in terms of actually making it much harder for people to access and utilize those technologies. And unfortunately, we're seeing a similar situation with Russia now, as sanctions have been imposed there, that have made it impossible for citizens to be able to pay for VPNs or circumvention tools, and have also had several cloud services pull out of Russia due to some of the kind of payment implications as well. And so, again, we see a situation where we want to see more information flowing to Russia. We want to see more truthful and independent information getting there, particularly at this time, and then watching sanctions actually kind of cut the legs right out from some of those efforts.
Yeah, just to unpack, so VPN being a virtual private network, probably most of us use that for our work, but just in case you throw some jargon that folks don't know, obviously call us out on that. Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe to take it in a slightly different direction, some of the things that, I guess I've written about but have been thinking about is, and again, this is, speaking on behalf of Josh, not DoD or fun stuff, is the role that DoD kind of could have in this space. And it strikes me that, well, first of all, like as a first principle, right, OTF and the State Department and others exist to provide these services and exist to, help support, internet freedom around the world for the reasons that you discussed previously. But, one of DARPA's superpowers and one of the DoD's superpowers is technology. And there's thankfully an increasing amount of funding in kind of existing, how do we get solutions right now to the people who need them? Yeah. But I wonder, and again, just my own personal, opinion or perspective, whether we couldn't, as part of the DoD, essentially fund more what amounts to fundamental research in this space. And so, just to kind of throw it out there, DARPA often will support, a COCOM, like we'll support US Pacific, Indo-Pacific Command, or, EUCOM. Why couldn't we support the State Department, right? Why couldn't we create these technologies in such a way, and essentially build out that pipeline in not in like any kind of official way, but the program running race, I think we're kind of sort of doing that, at least if everything is successful, which we always hope it will be. But I definitely think that that's another thing that we could do, especially if we reprioritize maybe some of the stuff that are like our service labs, like AFRL and ARL and NRL, we decided to chase after. I think DoD could play an enhanced role in this space. Roger, do you have anything on this?
Yeah, so the flip side of what you were just talking about, Josh, there is a thriving industry of surveillance tools, and a lot of those are based in the US and Europe. So we heard in the last session from Perry about NSO Group and Pegasus software that they do for breaking into phones, but we've got huge companies in the US like Palantir, Blue Coat that I think now is owned by Intel, Cisco. These are big companies that invest in surveillance and assist authoritarian regimes in building and maintaining their firewalls. So there's some complexity to the discussion here. And absolutely, the US government should be helping build the ecosystem of internet freedom tools. But at the same time, from a impedes or helps side, there's a huge industry that we have implicitly endorsed because we're not doing anything about it. I remember talking to an FBI guy long ago about how Blue Coat, a Sunnyvale, California company, was running the surveillance and censorship infrastructure in Syria against the export controls that they weren't supposed to be doing that. And the FBI guy is like, look, do you want us to be watching them or do you want Huawei to be watching them? And I'm like, I don't want either. That's not how this is supposed to be working. So there's a more complicated ecosystem here, and it's not just about supporting internet freedom tools. It's about figuring out what industries we're already supporting, and maybe we should stop or sanction them, or
I think one of the interesting things that came out of the NSO Group stuff is actually thinking through what amount to export controls for these kinds of technologies. Now, as a cryptographer, I have a deep ingrained reaction to export controls that I kind of have to get over. But for anyone who knows the history of public key cryptography and how export controls, affected that, and so if we have time, maybe we can dive into that. But to change tack a little bit and go more towards talking about like things happening on the ground right now. So Laura, can you talk a bit about, and we'll do Laura. Sorry, excuse me. We're going to do Roger and then Laura, as I'm realizing that if I stare directly down and speaking directly into the microphone. To what extent are Russia, China, and Iran different from an internet freedom tech perspective?
Yeah, so we could do a whole session on each of these countries and how they work. One of the most interesting things from my perspective, China by far spends the most money on oppression. And a lot of what they, and the part that I see of what they do is the technical side, where they do internet censorship at a good scale. They're very good at it. They've been doing it for a long time. Whereas Russia spends a lot more of its energy on misinformation and disruption. So yes, you can get to the website, but 20 other people already got there and said weird things, and you don't know what to believe. So yes, you're reading the news, but you know the news is wrong. So what can you believe at that point? So that it's a sort of a soft power versus hard power sort of thing. To double down on what you were talking about sanctions earlier, Laura, so Iran has this goal of building what they call a halal internet. They want to isolate themselves from the internet, and they want to have an Iranian Facebook, an Iranian Twitter, an Iranian Gmail, and then they don't have to let their users reach those bad Western companies, and then they can control what people think the internet is. And Iran keeps trying to do this. They keep trying to cut off the internet, and too many people complain because they're like, screw you, I'm a Gmail user, and I want to be able to get to my Gmail. And that means that ordinary people and companies push back when they turn off the internet. But then Trump comes along with his sanctions and his maximum pressure sanctions and calls up Google and Microsoft and so on and says, hey, could you do me a favor? Could you, like, anybody who's speaking Persian, can you turn their accounts off? And that means the next time Iran starts doing blocking, it isn't screw you, I'm a Google user, turn it back on. It is screw Google, they didn't want me anyway. So those sanctions are allowing Iran to succeed at isolating itself. And every time I was reading a new news article from some American telco that's like, we're pulling out of Russia, that'll show them. It's the same thing they're gonna do. Once you make it the American companies that are disconnecting, you're allowing the isolation to succeed.
So Laura, what's your perspective on this, especially as someone who provides a lot of funding for solutions in this space?
Yeah, I think the thing I would build on China in particular is that I think in spending, in kind of technical sophistication, and especially in digital surveillance, they're just in a league of their own. I think a lot of people group these three countries together, which I'm sure you have done intentionally, but really China looks a lot different. I think as we start looking at Chinese smart cities and their integration with social credit and their integration with physical surveillance, you're looking at a level of kind of real-time mass surveillance that has never existed and doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. And it is almost censorship 2.0 in that at that point you are just perpetuating such self-censorship that actually having to censor speech online actually becomes a lot less valuable. And so I think for me, the direction that China is moving and the fact that they are perpetuating the smart city model becomes really the next challenge, I think, for internet freedom in a very big way. The other thing I think is really interesting / concerning about the China model is how successful they have been at building their own kind of domestic alternatives to a lot of the technologies that Roger was talking about. So, we have the situation in Iran where when you turn off Gmail or when you turn off Instagram or something, the public there is an outcry and they feel pressure to turn it back on. In China, they have successfully built up domestic alternatives for all of these things, WeChat and Weibo, Alibaba, et cetera. And so we're now at a point where there's an entire generation of Chinese citizens who don't actually know what the rest of the global internet looks like. So when you start thinking about, censorship, it's no longer those technical firewalls. We're getting into a space of surveillance and self-censorship, and then even a space where there is a generation of folks who aren't even seeking outside information because all they know is the domestic alternatives that they've lived with their entire lives. And so that Chinese model, both in just kind of how sophisticated it is, but how comprehensive it is, I think is the most kind of startling and concerning to me. And I will, I think what Roger said on Iran is perfectly right. I do want to touch on Russia really quickly because I think it's an interesting case. From a kind of internet freedom technical perspective, for a very long time, there was this theory that the Russian internet was so decentralized that the Russian government was never going to be able to have full centralized control again. Whereas, the Chinese government built up its entire internet infrastructure and has had that centralized control from the beginning. Russia's internet infrastructure was decentralized, built out by a lot of networks, continues to be very diverse. So there was this idea that very aggressive centralized censorship in Russia could never exist. You couldn't put the toothpaste back in the bottle. What I think is really concerning about the Russia model that we are now seeing is that with the implementation of some of their new technologies, and especially with the centralization of DPI, they have demonstrated—
Deep packet inspection.
Thank you, deep packet inspection. They have demonstrated over the last year that they are actually able to centralize that control and centralize that censorship in a way that historically we had not thought possible. And it's not perfect. There are varying degrees of implementation across the country, but it is far more comprehensive than I think we thought it would be for a very long time. And so from an internet freedom perspective, China concerns me because it is the worst case scenario. Russia concerns me because it's a model that others could replicate. There aren't a lot of other countries in the world who are going to take be able to spend the billions of dollars and then put the millions of people to these issues that China does. But the approach that Russia has taken a decentralized network, started to control it slowly over time with policies and millions of dollars, which other governments do have, is far more replicable to a lot of countries who are becoming more and more interested in controlling the information space. So in some ways, while it's a less sophisticated approach, I think it's more concerning.
One thing I wanted to jump in on, so just touching on some stuff that I think the both of you talked about. So, Laura, you were talking about the kind of, especially the proliferation of Chinese internet freedom, internet censorship technology. Yeah. And then Roger, you were talking about, how maybe we should think about, controlling the export of U.S. technologies in this space. It occurs to me that, and I'm hardly the first person to say this, that, the export of these technologies by China is in and of itself a way of their doing soft power. So in other words, and actually put a different way, they are massively incentivized to build out technologies that are extremely sophisticated in this space, right? Much more so than I think we would be. And so we have this kind of dual catalyst of them working incredibly hard to build ever more sophisticated technology, and then looking to export it in such a way that, essentially that's their way of providing an alternative vision of the world to large parts of the world. And so, again, it's not like I think it adds a wrinkle to thinking through kind of, control of tech proliferation is just a very complex, complex thing to deal with.
Yeah, I ended up as the only technical person in the room in Germany when they were trying to figure out what Germany should do about its exports controls for these sorts of things. So it was a weird phenomenon where mostly it was lawyers and politicians, but periodically they would look down and say, Roger, what does the technical community think about this? Which was a weird role to play. But the most memorable part of that was talking to a telco engineer from Dubai who was like, look, you folks mandated what you call lawful intercept in the routers. You mandated backdoors in the routers. And so now every router has a backdoor in it. And my prince asks what that plug is for, and I explain it's for lawful intercept, and my prince decides what the law is. So now you're angry when I start using the functionality of the router that America sold me for surveilling? You built in a backdoor and now you're upset when I use it? So you're right, there are a lot of wrinkles there, because in the US, maybe we have a robust rule of law where we trust our judges, and the same technology gets plugged in somewhere else, and why are we surprised what happens?
Interesting. Okay. So to jump a little bit, so we just spent a bunch of time talking about Russia, China, and Iran. What countries should we be talking about that we aren't? In terms of the general discussion on internet freedom, what are the places that are just kind of underappreciated in terms of looking at the current trend lines or just trying to glean important information? And we'll start with Laura, and we'll go to Roger.
I think you actually just said it in your last remarks, Josh. I think for me, from a technical perspective, it's always really interesting to look at the worst case scenarios, right? You want to figure out surveillance in China, and you want to figure out censorship in Iran. And I think sometimes because of that, we lose the forest for the trees a little bit. And so I would say focusing in particular on those tipping point countries, which is exactly what Russia is doing. I mean, what China is doing right now with their Belt and Road Initiative, focusing on Belt and Road countries, focusing on countries in Africa that are at the point where they are making decisions about, what they think the future of the global internet should look like and what their infrastructure is going to look domestically. I think those are the times where we have the most opportunity to intervene. And the Chinese government sees that clearly. They are investing with, resources and technology, and in many cases personnel, to be able to push countries towards kind of their vision of the internet. And I think those are the places that it's most important for us to start looking at as well. I think once a country, gets past a certain point, it's going to be harder and harder to bring them back into kind of the free and open internet norms that we are aspiring to create or hold on to. And so being able to intervene at those kind of tipping point countries, I feel like they get lost a lot, and I think they're where the battle is actually going to be won or lost.
Interesting. Roger?
Yeah, so I'll give you the surprise answer, which is Australia. Australia censors its internet. Now, to be fair, Denmark censors, Sweden censors, the Netherlands censor, Belgium censors, a surprising set of Western countries censor. But Australia is a good example here because, everybody starts with, we have to block Pirate Bay, think of the children, whatever their politician says at first. And then you build your censorship infrastructure. You buy it from Cisco or Huawei or whoever you buy it from. And then you typically outsource the building of your censorship list. So Australia went to some third-party company and said, hey, what should we censor on the internet? And they ended up with a big list of lots of things, including anti-abortion websites and stuff that weren't in the initial argument for why they needed to censor. It turns out there was a dentist's website on this list, and I guess because somebody had broken into the dentist's website and put malware on it, and so it ended up on the list. And then the dentist cleaned up his website, and there was no mechanism for getting removed from the censorship list because nobody had thought about that side of it. And when the US State Department goes to China and says, you're a bad country because you censor the internet, and China says, look, Australia does it, we're just trying to keep our citizens safe, just like everybody else. Why are you picking on us? That really removes all the argument that the US State Department can have about countries are bad when they censor if all these other countries are doing it, and we can't fix the fact that Australia thinks they should censor the internet, how are we going to fix the fact that China thinks they should?
All right, I'll bite. So, I certainly don't have a perfect answer here. And I remember sitting with, but surely there's an issue of scale. So I think what you've talked about a lot, and I think it really does matter, is this notion of a tipping point. That it's very easy to come up with specific examples that, certainly at an emotional level, and heck, at a rational level, feel like very reasonable that these are things that we ought to keep off the internet. And I think the point that you've made a couple times is that we should realize that doing that creates structures that inevitably can be misused by folks. And to say just the word censorship, we need to be more careful because, yes, China censors the internet, but some of these European countries, also censor the internet in some fashion. But isn't there something to be said for scale? Or put a different way even, isn't there something to be said for intent, right? So in other words, the Australians are censoring their internet, but what they're not trying to do, right, is to create a population scale repression mechanism in so doing, right? So like surely there's some line. I don't know where it is, and in fact, I think the difficulty that we all kind of know is that it's extraordinarily difficult to find that line. But I'd be remiss if I did not point out that there does appear to be a line between kind of, what we're seeing in even countries like Australia and then what we're seeing in places like China, Iran and the like.
Yep. The challenge on the other side is it's a slippery slope where you buy the censorship infrastructure, you put it in place, and the dashboard has all these categories: politics, news, anti-abortion, Republicans, and so on. And you check one of them because that's the one that your politicians told you to put in place. And every day you come into work and there's a new scandal of some sort, and if you just press that other button, which you've already paid for, it's already in place, then you feel like you can solve that problem. So every time people deploy one of these, they slip down the slope of adding a few more categories because it's so easy to do.
I would just add to the point you said, where is that line? I think one of the biggest challenges is that the US and other democratic countries have such a hard time articulating and representing how these norms should be played out in practice, where the Chinas and the Irans and the Russias of the world not only have the perfect policies that you should implement, and they have the technologies that they'll give you and they'll help you do all of the work. Their playbook is very clear. Ours is, as democracy and human rights always are, is complex and murky. I think there's a lot of work to be done that could be done, though, still to clarify that and say, what is a rights-based approach to this where we are actually pushing that forward as opposed to just saying, well, that's wrong and that's wrong and that's wrong and that's wrong.
It was funny because I know Walter, so based on a conversation Roger and I had a couple years ago, I think on like Juniper firewalls that were like censoring Tor. So I went onto the internet and I was searching like, how do I configure a Juniper firewall to block Tor? And the overwhelming answer I got was from American high school system administrators who were trying to keep students from using Tor to bypass the high school firewall. Just to, as a whatever, like these things happen at a variety of levels of abstraction, and it probably was like geo-based out of the Google search that I particularly did from that day. But to change pace or change direction a little bit, so Laura, I was hoping you could talk to us because I know you've certainly gotten this a lot over the last couple years. How are shutdowns different from internet censorship? And then if you want to, additionally, should the US government have a policy of like combating internet shutdowns, and how might they go about doing it?
Yeah, great question, and a lot of parts to that. First, in terms of kind of like distinguishing shutdowns from online censorship, from an OTF perspective, we typically define a shutdown as basically an intentional, indiscriminate disruption of a network. So that means, you're pulling the plug on the entire internet, or you're pulling the plug on all 4G. Whereas we think of online censorship as being, intentional and content specific. You are looking to block either a platform specifically or a discussion, a topic, or a word specifically. And so that kind of indiscriminate aspect of it is what becomes really important to us in terms of defining a shutdown in particular. I will say, and I've heard this from a lot of civil society globally, that for many people in the world, Facebook is the internet to them, right? So if Facebook is censored by their government, it does feel like a true internet shutdown. And so I want to put that out because I'm not trying to discount what that experience is for people when they are experiencing whether that is technically censorship or a shutdown. But I do think distinguishing them from a technical perspective is really important because it leads to different technical solutions and approaches. And obviously the indiscriminate kind of blocking of networks becomes much harder to solve for from a technical perspective when people are being cut off from a network entirely. So in terms of, do I think the US government should have an approach for this? Yes, absolutely. It seems like low-hanging fruit to call out governments who are shutting down the internet. While we just talked about a lot of places where democracies are murky, one thing that is pretty straightforward is not shutting down the internet, not completely cutting people off from that connection. And it feels like a very easy thing for the US government to take a more full-throated stand on, in terms of not only advocating for that not to happen, for pushing governments not to do it, especially in advance of elections or important kind of political anniversaries, and calling out other governments that do. We've been hesitant to do that in the past, and I think it would make a big difference. And then I think there are also just technical interventions that are needed and timely, and just more investment in that space. As we did with online censorship, a decade ago, the US government began investing significant resources in making sure that people could circumvent repressive censorship and access information. A decade later, I think internet shutdowns is kind of that new challenge for us. And so I think that needs kind of a consistent commitment of resources and technical investment to start identifying, peer-to-peer solutions and other types of mesh or decentralized network solutions to start combating those shutdowns.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll just add like two quick things. I mean, the one thing that I didn't hear you say we had, because I don't believe we do, is we don't really seem to have like people think we might have like a tool on the shelf that we can just pull off and turn the internet on, right? And so I think it would behoove us to think in the long term, because these shutdowns happen in places that we care about so often, to have a set of solutions on the shelf that at least provide options.
Yeah.
But part of that, I know, especially in one case, people were thinking of this one solution that was it was an airborne solution, and it was going to provide like cell connections to everybody, and it hadn't like really been tested. And one of the things that like it would be interesting to see, and like again, one thing that DoD has is like ranges. And so especially as we think, often when you're trying to turn on the internet, what that really looks like is you're trying to provide some kind of wireless connection for people to have, because you can't really put trons through the wires when they've turned, the stuff off. And so, it would be interesting to start running like tests to actually see what would be effective, especially in the scope of like very basic jamming or something like that.
I think those tests would be critically important. The only thing I would add there is, I think, not only thinking about like the range and the technical effectiveness, but also the security of the users. I think a lot of times kind of the solutions of, we'll provide cell or we'll do satellite internet are effective from potentially a technical perspective, but fail to think about what the risks are for the end user at the end of the day. If you're in Iran and you're setting up, a satellite receiver to get satellite internet, like that's identifiable. If you're doing that in Russia, like what are the implications for the end users who ideally in these systems you're trying to support? So I think the technical analysis is important, but I think the risk assessment has to go hand in hand with that in order for it to be effective.
So I want to get to this audience question we're looking at, but I have one more question I wanted to make sure we ask, which is, and we'll start with Roger on this one. How do you approach the question of trust in these tools by the end users? So, somewhat famously, Tor was initially funded by the Naval Research Lab as well as by DARPA. Therefore, obviously, you have backdoors in your system that you provide all of us access to. And I'm kidding. Jesus. But obviously, this is a thing that you get accused of like every year. How do you talk about trust to users who, in countries where they simply just don't trust the US government?
Yeah, so the answer that we have is transparency. Yep. The answer that we have is Tor is free software, open source, but also we give you documentation, design documents, specifications, what we think it does, why we built it that way, what we hope it does, and we're very open. I go to conferences, other Tor people go to conferences, we wear bright green t-shirts saying, hi, we're from Tor, we're happy to explain anything about how it works. And also, so it's also about trusting your users to decide what they want. We had, early on in the process Laura was describing about the US government funding of internet freedom, there were plenty of senators who thought they were funding democracy around the world. And our tool gives people the ability to speak and learn on the internet, and if they choose democracy, fine. And if they don't choose democracy, also fine. These are not synonyms. And doing that education of what Tor is for and what Tor is not for, openness and transparency is the best answer we've got.
Yeah, I mean, very, very similar. I would say we kind of work on the the trust but verify principle, which is to say that we do try to build trust with our communities by really engaging deeply with civil society, with journalism communities, with human rights defenders all around the world to make sure that we're understanding their needs, their threats, their challenges, and so that we are investing in developing tools that are really based on what we're hearing from them, and that we are putting funding into those communities and into those solutions. And so I think building that trust is critically important. But we also don't take that trust for granted, and so I think that's where the transparency part becomes so important for us. So that has been core to OTF from the very beginning. We support free and open source technology, so everyone can see the code of our tools. We also require all of our technologies to go through third-party security audits before they are deployed, and then to continue to go through them regularly if we continue to fund them. Those security audits are published on our website, and so that information is available to our users. We also do a ton of research and have that peer reviewed to make sure kind of the challenges we're thinking about and the solutions that we are coming to is informed and public and kind of can be critiqued by the broader internet freedom community. And then lastly, we put, aside from a very, very small portion of super sensitive projects, everything we fund on our website. So for us, and we run open and competitive public solicitations. Anyone can apply to us for funding at any time. So for us, it's really about building trust intentionally with the communities that we're aiming to serve, but then making sure that they can also hold us accountable and hold our tools accountable through open source code, through security audits, and through transparency on our website.
Yeah, I know. I mean, just in a complete microcosm compared to what you all are dealing with. When I started the rates program, well, first of all, I mean, I did it in conjunction with OTF, with at the time Libby Liu, who was the CEO, I think, of OTF, and of course with the State Department. And then you all introduced me to the Internet Freedom Festival, where I went to Spain, and I got very politely asked if I would backdoor our system, and said I would not. But also, again, the critical part is that all of our software will be open sourced. We have tried to be as transparent as possible. Probably the one wrinkle, especially from a DARPA perspective, is just we do risky research, and I want to give our developers the time and the freedom to be as risky. Like, I don't need someone looking and writing blog posts about every single decision we made on or whatever. And so let's get stable code first, which is always a fun part for DARPA, and then we'll release it. And so I'm actually pretty excited. We're getting near the end of our program, and we're going to be we'll be open sourcing really everything that we have. So that's awesome. So we have a couple minutes left, and I'll bring us to audience question. And I'll leave this open to either of you who may want to take it. When do you think 5 and 10 years? When you think 5 and 10 years out, I can read. What do you think will be the threats to resilient and anonymous internet access? So what technologies? And on the flip, so what are the threats going to be, and what do you think the solutions may be over the next 5 to 10 years?
I can jump in on the threat side.
Sure.
That's the one that bothers me most. So we're seeing it already, centralization. There are only a few cloud providers. There's Akamai and Cloudflare. There are only a few platforms. There's Amazon and Google, or Apple and Google. There are only a few cables underneath the Atlantic Ocean. So you think of the internet as this huge, diverse, dispersed thing, but actually the centralization that we see at all levels is a threat to stability, where if they get a backdoor into Apple's thing, then suddenly, or if Apple has a bug, then suddenly everybody who has their Apple device has a problem. And if Akamai decides they don't want to provide service to Russia, then suddenly no websites are available in Russia. So this centralization is already, it produces brittleness, which makes attacks really easy.
Go ahead.
Well, so to give you a way, I want to poke you a little bit.
Yeah.
So the classic thing that we see everywhere right now is deep packet inspection, which is to say every packet that you see, every piece of information gets examined at line speed. But often, what we're seeing, I think pretty much everywhere in the world right now, is that's done via a very fixed set of rules. We haven't seen machine learning yet be thrown at deep packet inspection. And the reason that could matter is because if you're doing fixed rules, well then you can't really find anything new. You're doing it based on just catching fixed rules. Whereas for machine learning, there's the ability to catch much more sophisticated things because you're kind of building out that structure of what it is that you're finding. We have been talking about that actually, in fairness, in the community for whatever it is, a decade or more. Would you count that as part of the threat that's upcoming, or is that more, or is that actually not the big, not the big kind of next coming thing?
Yeah, we'll see. So the big game in terms of deep packet inspection is false positives. The big game is if the censorship devices, they have some rule where they say that flow is allowed, that flow is not allowed. And if they get it wrong, then the vice president's email didn't get through and somebody gets angry.
Right.
So the challenge that Cisco and Blue Coat and Huawei have is to censor in a way that succeeds without blocking anything else. So as you add the fancy machine learning complicated stuff in, I'm sure there's a room full of PhDs at Cisco right now who are wrestling with exactly this question. How do we make our stuff smarter without backfiring? Right. And they haven't done it yet. I guess eventually they will, because machine learning will be part of everything eventually.
Right.
But I don't know when that'll happen and how bad it'll be when it does.
Yep, and I want to, just the thing to surface there is that when we talk about deep packet inspection, these are technologies that can be used at like home networks, they can be used at corporate networks, and they can be used at country scale. And what you're saying is basically, at country scale, the false alarm rate's a killer. Because if I start throwing out random packets on the internet, the internet is dark and full of terror. There's any number of things that could be happening there. You could like crush a hospital accidentally because they're running some weird custom protocol and it doesn't, so okay, great. I really want to thank you all for your time. This was awesome, and thank you for having us here. So yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Great.